This video is all about drawing folds on dynamic figures. For an artist drawing a comic book, you need to be able to draw a wide variety of figures in a wide variety of poses, and then be able to drape clothing on those figures convincingly, quickly, and easily. I did a video on clothing and folds quite a while ago on this channel, and I'll go ahead and link that in this video's description or put a thing up in the corner if I can figure it out. Either way, you should be able to find it, and a lot of those skills are really going to be applicable to what we're doing here, so I really recommend you take a look at that video too, so you can see how some of these folds interconnect and some of the theory behind that. But in this video, we're going to go ahead, draw some figures, and then we're just going to start draping clothing on those figures already drawn. And be sure to stay tuned to the end of the video. I'll have some examples from my favorite artists for referencing folds, and I really recommend you give it a try. And then I want to show an example from an artist that draws folds really well on his own, but also uses photo reference and integrates that into his work for a really much more realistic effect. I'm David Finch. I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years, 27, almost 28 years. It's been a long time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. So in order to begin, I've gone ahead and drawn a seated figure really without clothing in mind, and I made sure to sketch in just enough anatomical detail that I'll have something to drape my clothes on, so our clothing will look like it's properly resting on a figure. I'm just lightening it down, and then I'm going to start with some major landmarks. I'm going to start with the collar around his neck, and the other side of the collar. Just get that drawn in. This is something that reference can really help you with if you're not familiar with how to draw something like a collar. I'm drawing the seams over his arms where his sleeves attach to the body of his shirt, and then his cuffs. And notice I'm going with straight lines and corners rather than curves. It's just a little bit more powerful. So I'm drawing in his belt. It's another major landmark delineating the line from his shirt to his pants. And now I'm going to go ahead and just start sketching in some folds around some major tension points. So where his elbow bends, it's going to be a lot of bunching of fabric. And it needs to lead up into where his shoulder is stretching the fabric back. And then it all terminates at his cuff. And I'm making sure to be aware of where my fabric stretches and where it pinches and draw folds out from those places. And so it's a matter of understanding how to draw simple folds, how to draw interlocking folds, and then knowing where they're going to radiate from and where they're going to radiate out to. It's all about tension points, and understanding a few simple tension points like around the elbows and around the shoulders, around the crotch and the knees is really all you need to know to be able to get a fairly realistic looking set of folds on your anatomy. And I'm obviously making sure to reflect the underlying shapes. And so I'm drawing a seam through his pants here, and then some folds coming up over his leg. This is something that reference can really help you out with. I'm doing this without reference, and I'll be doing all of these to begin without any reference at all. I'm really basing these completely on my own knowledge over the years of how to draw folds. There are holes in my knowledge, and I end up referencing quite a bit. When I'm in a pinch, I really don't have time to reference folds, and so it's important that you know how to represent folds well enough to be able to get by. But if you want to make things more realistic and you want to bring it to the next level, reference can really help you out. So I've got a lot of bunching around both of his knees, and you can see that I've got a tension point at his ankle on his raised leg. And so the back of the leg has the fabric pushed right against it, and it's draping out toward the front of his leg because it's really where the tension is pulling the fabric. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to start tightening in what I had originally drawn. Sketching in is a really great way of establishing everything that you want, making sure that you have something that works for you without locking yourself into something and making it difficult for you to erase if you have problems. It can be really tempting to go with something that's just not right if you've put too much work into drawing it. So I really recommend that you sketch in these things first until you're much more comfortable. And then when you're happy with what you have overall, you can go ahead and tighten up your lines. And so I'm just reinforcing all of the same things that I did before, radiating out lines from his shoulders, over his chest and around his stomach where it bunches. There's a really interesting connection between, you can see he's got radiating lines downward from his right shoulder, and they terminate along some bunching folds around his stomach. I have been studying that lately, but it's not actually really a strong suit of mine, and I don't feel like I've represented it well here, and I think it would have been a good place for me to actually get up a little bit of reference, and I would do that. But for the sake of this, I wanted to really show how far I can take folds just out of my own head, just from my own experience. This is something you really need to learn to do for yourself, because it's just not possible to reference every figure and every fold in a comic and manage to hit any sort of a deadline. You really need to develop a pretty strong shorthand of creating these folds yourself. So I'm radiating my folds out from his raised leg, up along the leg, and now I'm drawing some folds around his lower leg at the crotch where there's a bit of a bend, and then drawing some more folds on his knee and draping down toward his foot. And that really actually looks much more like just draped cloth. If you had two pins in it, it's a very similar effect. So we're going to go ahead and move on to another figure. This is another figure that I've drawn really without folds in mind at all. It's just a different figure in a different pose. I've lightened it down, and I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to just draw the folds this time instead of doing a sketch. I still recommend that you do sketches just to make yourself more comfortable. But I started with a collar, and now I'm just moving into some major tension points around his elbow, drawing in my cuff, and connecting the elbow to the end of the arm. That's something that really needs a bit of study to be able to know how to go from those really tight interlocking folds and ease it out along a form. I'm drawing some radiating folds out from under his arm. His arm is really pulling forward, and so it would really pull the fabric, and then it bunches around his waist the same way that it did in the other figure. It's a very, very similar effect, just from a different angle. And you'll notice, hopefully, as I do these, that I'm really drawing the same basic folds in really the same places. And so once you get a decent understanding of how these work together, you can really draw folds on any figure relatively easily. It gets much, much easier, and you'll still need reference. And there are places where reference really can make things much more believable, and it's really a great tool that you shouldn't neglect. But again, being able to do this on your own is very important. So I'm drawing the folds around his knees. And notice how I've got the folds curving in toward the knee, the top of the knee, from the top and from the bottom, so they kind of curve toward each other. And that's something that you'll notice in any kind of realistic folds from photo reference or just looking at your own leg. And your elbow really does the same thing. So it's an important thing that as you come up toward the knee, they curve in toward the knee, and then as you come down toward the knee, they curve in toward the knee, and then they kind of connect, they meet at the middle. And so very quickly, I managed to get a series of folds interconnecting over the whole body. It's a fairly simple thing, and I'm just going without any shadow, just some basic fold shapes, just enough to really give the impression of clothing over my figure. Cleaning things up just a little bit more here and getting it all, making sure everything works. I don't like the hard fold that he has over his shoulder, so I'm just softening that up just a bit right there. And I think that works just a little bit better. I've got a bit of a tangent with the fold and some of his collar, but I think with shadow that's going to work out, so I'm just leaving it. Tightening some of the folds across his lower stomach, because there's a lot of bunching, those folds would be a little bit tighter and smaller than what I had drawn. And so now for our last figure, before we go into some specific study, unfortunately, I lightened this one down before I started recording, so we're starting with a figure that's lightened down pretty significantly. Hopefully you can still see it. And so I'm just drawing in his head, I'll draw in his hands, and some of the things that really aren't folds, just so I can at least have a bit of a completed figure to work with. So just establishing his hands, and now I'm going to go ahead and draw shoes on his feet. So I'm drawing a heel, and then the actual, the rest of the shoe, the rest of the bottom of the shoe. If it has a name, I don't know what it is. And then some of his ankle there. And now the other foot here. Shoes can be a very difficult thing to draw in perspective. Properly. I don't know that these are really perfect, but they're good enough for me to work with here. And I have at times been known to just get out some of my own shoes and move them to different angles just to make sure that I've got it right. So I've gone ahead and drawn his belt, and now I'm drawing his pants. This is a seam along his leg. Here, he's got a little bit of bunched up folds just under his butt, and it's very, very mild. I don't want to get too heavy with those because a straight leg like that doesn't really have a huge amount of folds. Just a little bit of bunching around his knees. I've got his lower pant leg kicking up a little bit backwards over his ankle. I think if the figure wasn't in motion, then it would be draping down off of his ankle instead of kicking up from it. But I want to make it look like the figure's in motion. That's why I pushed that opening upward off of his ankle. Drawing a couple of pockets, a seam down the center, and now I'm drawing the seams in for my arms and my collar. Again, these are just major landmark points, and it's a good thing to get these established. Under his shoulder here, I've got some tension points coming from his back over his shoulder, and then around his wrists, again, just like I did before. I'm gonna go ahead and connect my elbow to my cuff, and now I'm connecting my shoulder down to the elbow. And I feel like I basically drew the same fold, very large folds, and they're maybe a little bit wrong, so I tried to put a little more detail in there to fix it. I don't know if I really accomplished that as well as I could have, but I'm leaving it this time. I think that's something that I could probably use a little bit of reference for, because I'm not really sure exactly how to fix that in a way that I would really like. And so just drawing in the folds from his other arm, it's coming up toward you, and so I'm trying to wrap those folds around the form, and so they have a bit of a curl around the form. They're not just drawn flat. You really need to bear in mind that they're wrapping around forms, 3D forms in space. And so that basically covers the folds over this body. I kept them fairly simple. Hopefully you can see how simple you can really make this. It's just a matter of bunching up folds in the places where they commonly bunch, in the bend of the elbow, across the shoulders, at the waist, and then learning how to naturally connect those points. So from here, I wanted to go ahead and take a couple of figures a little further and just draw in some shadow. I'm using my existing folds and just drawing interconnecting shadow shapes. I'm going to go ahead and draw some shadow cast from his collar. Things like this are really nice to be able to just get blocked in, because they're a little bit more obvious and a little easier for me to throw in. I know exactly where they go. And I'm just using shapes that I've learned over the years, a few very, very simple shapes, and you'll see me repeat them over and over again in order to establish my interlocking folds. In a minute, as soon as we're finished with these couple of figures, just blocking in some lighting, I'll show you where I've gotten some of those shapes and how you can study them yourself. You'll notice that on his arm, I've gone ahead and put a shadow all along the bottom, because it's a simple tube with some detail on top of it. Because it's being lit from above, it would be darker below, and so I want to make sure that while I'm drawing in folds, I don't forget that I have an overall lighting for my figure that I'm establishing. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the other arm, so I'm just blocking in some shadow, connecting up my shapes just a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and finish off his elbow, the bend of his elbow, get those shapes interconnected. I'm drawing basically jagged shapes. I've got really maybe 1 or 2 or 3 tops different sorts of shapes that I draw, and they'll really come from an interpretation of simple folds. You really don't need to know a lot. You just need to know a couple of things and then know how to repeat them, making sure that your shapes vary just enough in size and placement that it doesn't end up looking completely uniform. It can be a bit of a challenge to avoid making things too uniform and end up looking a little bit fake, but a little bit of practice and a little bit of study really should sort that out fairly quickly. And so here I've drawn the folds along his stomach. These are just basically accordion folds pressed together where the fabric is bunching. And I've got folds radiating out from under his arm that then connect into those folds. And again, that's an area that I don't think I'm quite as strong at as I could be. And just doing this exercise is really reminding me of how much that's something I really need to work on. It is so easy to find reference on Google or whatever. You don't need to find a figure that's exactly in the pose that you're looking for. What you need to do is just find a figure with the arm raised up, the folds coming down from that point, which is how I've drawn it on my figure, and then connecting to some bunch folds here, and see how that interconnects. You can very easily make that very realistic looking. That's something I highly recommend you do. And really, if this was a figure I was going to complete for a comic, I think I would take that extra step and make sure to get that exactly right. And so I'm going to go ahead and shadow underneath his leg, just a little bit there, start to interconnect some bunched folds around his crotch on both sides, and then up along his leg. And you'll notice how I've got my folds kind of terminated along that seam. I think that's a little detail that really can add a lot to the believability of your folds. So now I'm just drawing the bunches around his knee here. And I have to say that I feel like I've really struggled with his lower leg just a little bit too. I really wasn't sure exactly how to approach this and to fade those folds out in a believable way. And I think this is another place where a little bit of reference kind of could have helped me out. And so it's a bit of a back and forth as I try and make that work. And I feel like that's fine, but I don't love it. And I think it could probably use just a little bit of reference. So now I'm moving into the other leg, radiating a couple of folds out from his crotch down along his leg and over his leg, parallel to his crotch, and then just finishing out his belt. And so now his knee, this is another place that can be a very, very difficult thing to get across believably and effectively, certainly for me. Folds starting at the knee and then draping down toward the ankle. and I don't really like what I've got there. I'm kind of moving on just for a second and just doing some lighting on the hand while I think about it. And now I'm going to dive back into it, and I'm just kind of throwing in shadow, and you'll notice that I get darker and darker as I don't like it, and I try and find a way to really kind of make it work for me. It's fine, really. Like, I don't think it's terrible. I could leave it just like that, but I think I'm going to go with the Wally Wood method, and that is when in doubt, black it out, and that's really kind of what I'm doing here. Because it's bending downward, it really realistically could be shown in shadow, and so I'm taking advantage of that and making that whole area for me just a little bit easier. And so now with the next figure, I'm basically doing the same thing, just shoring up all my shadow shapes and giving them just a little bit of weight. This is similar to using line weights, but it's a little bit more involved than that. I wouldn't want to just reduce it down to just completely what you would get from using line weights, but it has a lot of similarities. And you'll notice that I've got some larger shapes and some smaller shapes. I'm trying to make it as random as I can, but bearing in mind that it's very rule-based. Folds are incredibly rule-based, and you learn a couple of very, very simple rules, and it makes it easy to draw folds. So it's a bit of a paradox. You need it to be random, but you also need it to work with a uniform set of rules. I'm going to go under his shirt here. It gets pretty dark in there, so I'm just going to start blocking in some shadow into some of those places. I've got a pretty big fold in there, which I don't really like, and in order to fix it, I could erase and draw some smaller folds in there. I just kind of went with a little bit more shadow. It's usually my technique that I like best. If I don't like something, I just shadow it out, if I can. If that doesn't work, then it's time to pull out the eraser. So just connecting in some smaller folds. As it comes toward the light, they get smaller. As they go further from the light, they get larger, and that makes it fairly easy to understand. His far leg really should be dark. It's really heavily shadowed by the figure since with the lighting that I've got. So I've cast a shadow over most of his leg, and I'm just finishing out his belt. And now is actually a good time to point out too that you'll notice my folds actually affect the outline of the fabric too, and they actually bump up and out and create ridges along the edge of the fabric. It's not something that should just be drawn on the fabric. I've got some folds in his leg there. I don't really like them. I feel like it got a little bit big, and again, that leg is so much in shadow, I think it's actually more effective just shadowing it out anyway. And is it a cheat? Sure, it is, but so much of what we do really is, and I think it's an effective way of drawing it anyway. Drawing attention away from that leg and pushing it back gives the figure a little bit more dimension, so I think it worked. That's a cheat I'm pretty happy with. And so now I'm just going to go ahead and finish out some of the interlocking folds around his knee, up along his leg there. I'm stopping again at that seam, and it just gives that seam a little bit of believability. It's a technique, again, that I use all the time. It always works. And just finishing some folds down along his leg and casting a shadow over his ankle. And that's basically going to do it for this figure. Cleaning up his leg a little bit here. And then I'm going to give him a button on his cuff and a little bit of shadowing around it, and that's basically the figure. So hopefully you can see that having a strong figure underneath with realized anatomy, it doesn't need to be detailed anatomy because you're ultimately not going to be drawing it, but it needs to be there so you're draping folds over a finished body that feels like it has weight and dimension and not just some shapeless thing. And that's a very common mistake that I see people make, trying to draw folds without understanding or drawing through the underlying figure. So from here, I want to give you guys some strategies for how to figure out how to create these folds yourself. It's one thing to make a video like this and draw a bunch of folds and draw a bunch of small shapes and say this is what you do and that's the technique, and really it's true, that is, but you need to learn how to be able to do it consistently yourself. The way that I learned is looking at other artists, also looking at life, and I recommend doing that too. But you might find life can be very difficult to reference from if you're just starting out, and finding an artist that breaks things down in a really clear, interesting way is a great thing for you to study to get better at it much more quickly yourself. And so we're going to go ahead and look at some Eduardo Rizzo. He is one of my favorite artists. I've referenced him for many different things, especially his use of black and white and layering and composition. But he also does folds very, very well and in a really easy to understand, simple way. And he has beautiful shapes that he draws upon. These folds, I can't definitively say that he's doing these without reference, but I am pretty sure that these are all really kind of done without reference. I'm sure that he references here and there. We all do it, but really he has the ability to just create these folds from nothing out of his head. And so I'm just going ahead and I'm taking one of the legs in that first panel and I drew in the basic outline shapes, and now I'm just going ahead and drawing in the actual darkened in shadow shapes that he's got interlocked to create that fold pattern. It's pretty simple how he's got it put together. It makes it very, very easy to study, and you can get so much out of it right away. And you can see how that leg really, really works. And it's very simple and graphic. It's something that makes it much easier to study. So I'm going to go ahead and give this next figure a try. This is the man in the gray suit. At the bottom of this page, I'm just drawing in a basic sketch just to get my basic proportions down that I can go ahead and lay my folds down on top of. This time I'm not going in with simple line drawing. I'm actually just drawing in the shadow shapes. This is really much more how I do it. I don't actually draw in my outlines and then draw in my shadows onto that. I really just draw the shadows. So the way that I'm constructing these is much more how I would go about it. I do recommend you break it down when you're learning. It can be very, very helpful. But I'm basically drawing the same kinds of shapes again. Hopefully you can see just how much these correlate with the leg that I drew just earlier on. The folds in the crook of the arm are very similar to the folds in the crook of the knee. They're really the same thing. And now I'm going to draw some radiating folds out from under his arm. I really like how he's used some larger and smaller shapes and how he's got a little bit of cast shadow. He's got this large fold and then it's casting a shadow down over the large fold just beneath it. And it really, really sells that shape for me. And in some ways, I'm not worrying a huge amount about exactly what he's representing with each little spot. I think that you should, and it is good for study to understand exactly what you're drawing. But so much of this is just getting a feel for the kinds of shapes that he's drawing. And the more you do this, you will actually be able to start to create these shapes on your own consistently. And I think this is the kind of study that will make it much easier for you to do this on your own figures. So I'm not going to sit here and draw study after study from this book, but I do want to show you just a quick attempt at repeating some of those shapes for myself, just on my own. I'm just putting together some of the kinds of shapes that I was just drawing looking at reference from Eduardo Rizzo, just interconnecting some quick shadow shapes to create some folds. And I'm doing basically the same thing that I did in that sketch just below. I'm not really copying it, but you can see how it really creates a rhythm. Hopefully you can see these shapes interconnect together, creating a rhythm that's something that you can study and actually incorporate yourself. So now I've got one more example. Another thing that I love about Eduardo Rizzo's folds is he has a great ability to draw folds with a lot of shadow and get a lot of depth in them, but he also is really great at drawing clothing that just has folds represented with line and no shadow at all. And it gives his different types of clothing a lot of visual range. Also, I find his folds drawn without any shadow at all, you really get a bit of a better sense of exactly the kinds of shape structure that he's using. And so I'm drawing this figure in the upper right panel and just copying the interlocking shapes that he's got. It's very, very graphic and simplified. And this is why looking at reference like this can be so useful over looking at photographs where things can just get very, very confusing. And I'm just going to go ahead and draw a little bit of shadow in there, making up my own shadow just on top of what he had initially, just as an exercise, just to see what I can get from it. And you can see how, and hopefully you can see how his simple line folds can work with shadow just by throwing that on there. It all really is the very same technique. He's very consistent and very schooled in what he does. So now before we wrap this up, I mentioned a few times that you need to be able to learn how to draw your own folds on a figure without looking at any reference. But I also said that I use reference from time to time, and most other comic artists also do. And I wanted to show you another example of one of my favorite artists that can absolutely draw folds out of his own head. But he does use reference from time to time, and you can see how much it really brings to some of his figures. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at Daredevil by Joe Quesada. And in this first figure, he's got a man holding a baby. That shirt and those pants absolutely are using some photo reference. But because he's such a skilled artist at just drawing folds on his own, it doesn't read like he's just looking at photo reference. That's a figure that he's drawn in a really dynamic way and then used a little bit of photo reference just to make some of those folds a little bit more believable and trait maybe a little bit more naturally. This next example, I think, is maybe even a little bit more obvious. You can see that suit in the first panel looks very believable. He's got some great folds on the front leg just over the shoe, and some of the detailing around the collar and down the arm. Very, very well done. It's beautifully integrated, and he's done it in a really graphic way that wouldn't be possible if he was just using photo reference. So he's taking what he needs from the reference just to give it a little bit more believability, but then connecting it together with his own knowledge. And the other figures really show that. I can see a real mixture of his own natural knowledge in drawing folds and some photo reference here and there. The leg in that last panel is absolutely using some photo reference, and it just works beautifully and very, very graphically. And now it takes extra work to do this kind of reference, but what you can get from it can be very, very strong, and I definitely recommend that you do it. The ideal and most believable folds that you can draw really come from a mixture of your own study, your own ability to just draw folds from your head, and integrate them with what you can learn from photographs in reference. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to tune in every Monday night at 8 o'clock Eastern for Monday Night Draw with Meredith and Dave, and we will see you in the next video.